Hello, I'm James Neely. This is my project on the Eastern Front. I like to think of World War II as a different kind of World Series, with the Axis versus the Allies. In an attempt to make this presentation a reasonable length, and to stop it from going on and on and on like 9 innings of baseball, I have decided that I'm going to exclude the beginning of the fighting with Germany attacking Poland, and in an attempt to focus on the Russo-German fighting from June of 1941 to November of 1942. A brief summary of what happened to Poland was that Germany declared war on September 1st, 1939, and they quickly steamrolled the inferior Polish and just destroyed them really, really quickly and actually made them capitulate or surrender in just about 3 weeks. Operation Barbarossa. The Germans attacked the Russians after months of planning on June 22nd, 1941. The Nazis committed a lot of troops, somewhere around 3 million, to the attack of Russia. Their goal was to expand Germany and get Lebensraum for the Aryan people. The Soviets' condition. There were about 1.7 million Russian soldiers on the German border, which was about 170 Russian divisions, each consisting of around 10,000 soldiers. The Russian troops were not well supplied, with a quarter of the motorized divisions even having tanks. 4/5 of those tanks were super old and not working. 2/3 of the planes they had were old and not capable. And a quarter of soldiers were lacking the super vital radio equipment that the Germans had. Needless to say, the Russian defensive line was not ready for any kind of attack, yet alone such a massive German one. German condition. Unlike the Russians' complete unpreparedness or readiness for the fight, Germany was both ready and willing to fight. They had 129 German divisions and 19 tank divisions on the border. Each division was about 13,000 soldiers. They also had about 500,000 Finnish and 150,000 Romanians to help them fight the Soviets. They had thousands of tanks, 10,000 artillery guns, and around 2,000 planes. An overconfident Hitler believed and said that we have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down in regards to fighting the Russians. The beginning of the end. The Germans, as they had with Poland and the French, used the blitzkrieg strategy of lightning warfare. The Soviets were not ready for this lightning attack, and it just completely overwhelmed them. In only 2 days, the German Luftwaffe, or the Air Force, claimed to destroy over 2,000 planes. And in only a few days' time, the Germans had surrounded Minsk. Soviet military's failures. As opposed to Germany, who had some of the most advanced planes in the world, the Soviet Air Force, with their outdated planes, had to resort to physically ramming their planes into German planes. On land, so many Soviets had died that they had to call over 5 million soldiers to the fight. And once again, the Soviets only had 1/4 the number of radios that they needed. So communication was very dangerous, and it was not robust like the Germans. In contrast to the Soviet failures, the Germans were doing very well. In the south, they had surrounded Smolensk in mid-July of 1941, and they captured around 300,000 troops, which is a big deal. The Air Force, in just about a month, had destroyed around 5,000 planes, and the Germans had captured Kyiv, which was a vital city with around 600,000 soldiers captured. The road to Moscow. After the Germans had won a long series of fights, they decided that they needed to strike for the heart, so they would attack towards Moscow. Operation Typhoon was its name. It had around 70 divisions and 1,500 tanks, which was a very large attack. The Russians, in a desperate attempt to delay the Germans and hopefully stop them, did everything they could, destroying bridges, taking out signs, killing all their crops and animals so the Germans would starve to death. They tried everything. Unfortunately for them, the Germans were able to easily move toward Moscow, and then they also reached Leningrad shortly after. Siege of Leningrad. The Germans are, at this point, knocking it out of the park. They're winning, they're advancing towards Moscow, they're advancing towards Leningrad, and as they do so, they are blocking all lines of transportation into the city, stopping all supplies going into the city, causing the city to start rationing food and running out of food, which is not good for the Soviets. And while the Germans had an opportunity to take the city, they instead pulled troops off of the siege of Leningrad to help with Operation Typhoon attacking Moscow. And actually, they never even took Leningrad over around 3 years of fighting. Defense of Moscow. After only 3 months, the Germans had already advanced hundreds of kilometers into the Russian territory. They were just obliterating the Soviets and meeting very minimal resistance. Once they got around 100 kilometers away from Moscow, they encountered the Soviet 42nd Rifle Division. This was one of the Soviets' most well-trained and supplied units in the whole war. Unfortunately for the Soviets, after only about 5 days, they were encircled and captured. Luckily for the citizens of Moscow, the Soviets were able to pull 22 divisions from the Japanese front to help with the city's defense. And in only the defense of Moscow, the Soviets lost about 1.5 million men. Hitler's first of many mistakes. As the Germans got closer to Moscow, they encountered more and more resistance. This slowed progress, which Hitler did not like. He was all for just getting right to Moscow, so much so that it was actually called the Christmas Offensive, because he believed that the war would be over by Christmas. His mistake was that he was so overconfident in his troops that he didn't actually send them any winter supplies for the cold Russian winter. And by the end of November, the Germans were only about 30 kilometers away from Moscow, which is not that far. Pop quiz question. What was Hitler's first strike? It was, he did not send his troops any winter equipment for the cold and long Russian winter. Speaking of the cold and long Russian winter, the Germans were not ready for it. They had no winter equipment, no coats, and importantly, they had no antifreeze for any of their tanks, trucks, or other vehicles. It was actually so cold, around -40, that a hot spoon of soup would freeze before you got it to your mouth. On December the 5th, the Soviets started a counterattack to push the Germans back. The Germans were so close, yet so far, they could see the tops of the Kremlin with their naked eye. Freezing Germans. As the last few slides have said, it was really, really, really cold. Even for the Russians who are used to the cold, were not used to this cold. The Soviet counterattack was going very well. They managed to push the Germans back as far as 150 kilometers. Hitler had demanded that his troops stand their ground and not retreat, but they did retreat. In the south, the Germans had also been pushed back as the Soviets had charged around 20 divisions against the 1st Panzer Army. Wait, hold up. The Germans are losing their advantage? Near the beginning of 1942, the Soviets were actually able to push the Germans back. A major reason why they could was because of the development of the T-34 tank. It was able to just beat the once formidable German Panzer III, and when a Panzer III would shoot a T-34, the bullet would just bounce off the armor. It wouldn't do anything. Russia had a chance to push the Germans back, so they did. German atrocities. When you think of the Nazis, most likely the first thing that comes to mind are all of the horrible and just straight up vile crimes that they have done against humanity, whether it be the death camps or the mistreatment of pretty much everybody, and unfortunately the Eastern Front was no exception. If a Russian soldier was captured, they were lucky to be shot or something quick, Some of them, though, were cut up alive with axes or swords. Some were starved or forced to march till they passed out and died. Even the most patriotic German soldiers were just appalled at what they were being ordered to do. Sadly, of 5.5 million Russians that were captured, only about 2 million survived the war. I couldn't imagine being a Russian civilian in World War II. Seeing comrades being murdered or even raped in public, the constant fear that a German soldier could just shoot you down for no reason. It almost would make you feel like you wanted to just be shot down by a machine gun so you wouldn't have to witness it anymore. So you could just... Once again, the overconfident and big-talking Hitler believed that he could do anything better than anyone. This is what caused him to fire Heinz Guderian and Gerd von Rundstedt and instead take control of the army. He was mad at his generals because he blamed them for the slowing advance on the Soviet front, even though they were some of the best generals in the world. Question number 2. What was Hitler's second strike? The answer was that he took control of the army and fired some of his top generals. Counterattack. Over the winter, the Soviets had managed to plan this massive attack that would push the Germans back. And while it did actually push them back, it was very badly planned, which meant that the Soviets actually lost many more times the troops than Germany did. So while it technically was a victory, it was also kind of a loss for the Soviets. And they were actually able to encircle about 90,000 Germans near the city of Demyansk. German war machine. Although about 90,000 troops were encircled near Demyansk, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was able to airdrop 270 tons of supplies for the soldiers every day, which allowed them to survive until a corridor was opened up so they could retreat. And luckily for the Soviets, they were about to surround the German Army Group center. However, they were outmaneuvered, which allowed the Germans to surround and capture the Russian Kalinin army. And in the south, the Russian counterattack was completely stopped and German losses. Even though the Germans were, by pretty much all accounts, winning the war, they were losing the war of production to the Soviets and the war of attrition as well. The Germans were taking many casualties and were becoming undersupplied. They just couldn't produce enough as compared to how many they were losing. For example, from 1941 to 1942, they lost around 75,000 vehicles, but they only managed to produce 7,500 vehicles, meaning that they lost 10 times more than they produced, which is never. How are we doing at this point? Do we need a 7th inning stretch? I know it's a lot of information, all crammed into a little bit of time, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask me at this point, and then I'll continue the. All right, after that break, the Southern Front. On the Southern Front, the Russian counterattack began on May the 12th of 1942. The Soviets attacked with about 600,000 soldiers and were able to push the Germans back quite a ways. Unfortunately for them, they left their flanks weak. This is what Blitzkrieg is all about, exploiting weak flanks. So on the 17th of May, the Germans rushed across and closed the soldiers in, encircling them. This allowed them to capture about 250,000 soldiers and take a few hundred T-34s and a bunch of other equipment from the Russians. Hitler's third mistake. Since this war was dragging on and Germany was starting to run low on oil, Hitler decided that they needed to take over the Caucasus, which is in southern Russia. It has a ton of oil there. So the 4th Panzer Army was ordered by Hitler to attack the nearby and important city of Rostov. The planning was sound and it went well. However, the 4th Panzer Army, which was assigned to take the Caucasus, could have instead gone to Stalingrad with virtually no opposition. Hitler's mistake was that he tried to take Stalingrad and the Caucasus at the same time, spreading his troops out and making weak flanks. Pop quiz question 3. What was Hitler's third strike? It was to try and take Stalingrad at the same time as taking the Caucasus. After the Germans attacked the Caucasus, they split up into two fronts, the Caucasus front and the front at Stalingrad. Even though Stalingrad was super important for the war effort, the Soviet defenders there were not going to give up Stalingrad. They would fight until every single one of them had died. If the Soviets had lost Stalingrad, the war would have been almost certainly over. They were protecting it for their leader, Joseph Stalin, who they idolized. A common cry of these soldiers was, "For the motherland, Stalingrad." It began on August 23rd, 1942. Hitler had become obsessed with Stalingrad. He was devoted to taking it. He committed thousands and thousands of troops to the attack. The fighting was on city streets, in buildings, in stairways, super close quarters, and not fitted for the German doctrine of quick and lightning attacks. But it was very fitted for the Soviet army doctrine of fighting slowly and the war of attrition. Unfortunately for Hitler, he committed far too many troops and lost too many troops in this battle, and this was the final mistake that cost Hitler the Stalingrad. To go a bit more in depth into the fighting of Stalingrad, it was some of the most violent and brutal fighting ever, and the Soviets knew that they had to keep hold of the city, and if they lost the city, then the war was over, and they had basically no chance of surviving. And also, the Soviets were equipped and ready for this kind of fighting, whereas the Germans were not. They were not ready for such close quarter and slow fighting. Technically, the Eastern Front did not just end at the Battle of Stalingrad. However, the German advance did end after this battle, so as a way of shortening this presentation from 20 minutes to maybe 10, I have ended the Eastern Front here. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in Russian victory and allowed the Russians to quickly retake the Caucasus. The German army, and specifically General von Rundstedt, had disobeyed Hitler's direct orders and retreated. And after the failure of the campaign in the south, the losing battle in North Africa, and shortly after the invasion of Italy and D-Day, the German army just got overwhelmed by the number of enemy troops. Despite having the best military at the start of the war, with the most technologically advanced weapons and elite training to its army, they lost. And no, it wasn't the generals either. In fact, German generals were some of the smartest generals in the whole war. It was Hitler's fault. He tried to do too much at the same time, resulting in defeat. Hitler was not, and most likely will not, be the last nationalistic, power-hungry, and crazy dictator who will try to conquer the world. Before him, there was Napoleon, who lost to the Russian army because of the cold. So there are two takeaways that are vitally important. One, that as a species, we cannot repeat the horrors of World War II, because now a world war could be as quick as a press of a red button. Two, that now we just have to hope that Vladimir Lenin will not follow the same path as Hitler, because so far he has done the same that Hitler did in the beginning. Thank these sources for helping to provide information for this presentation.